state of infrastructure in India. State of state of infrastructure in India. So according to 2001 census, according to the report of 2001 census, India invests only 5% of GDP on infrastructure. That means 5% of GDP is invested on infrastructure. Okay, according to 2001 census. Okay, which is far below than China and Indonesia. Just below there is a table. Just below in your book, you see in page 122, there is a table is given below. China invests 20% of the GDP on infrastructure, and Indonesia invests 14% of their GDP on infrastructure. Comparatively, India invests far below, only 5% of GDP on infrastructure. Okay, next point is earlier the government has been solely responsible for the developing of the country's infrastructure. So earlier, that means it is clear that earlier government has tried, and government was only responsible for developing the country through infrastructure development. Okay, and that means before government has tried to develop the infrastructure projects. However, due to inadequacy of the government's investment in infrastructure, private sector in joint partnership with the public sector has started playing a very important role in infrastructure development. So due to the inadequacy of resources, due to the inadequacy of investment, due to the that means the basically the inadequacy of government's investment, that means the inadequacy of resources, infrastructure development and cannot raise in our country, and that is why private sector come forward, and they jointly private sector and public sector jointly they work and develop the infrastructure projects, and they started playing a very important role in our infrastructure development. That means when we see that earlier our government tried a lot to develop our infrastructure projects like irrigations, roads, railways, electricity development. There are so many infrastructure projects earlier government has tried, but due to insufficient of resources or inadequate resources, or due to lack of investment, our infrastructure projects cannot build up rapidly, and that is why our government understood that if the private sector and government sector, that means public sector, if they joint work together, then there are so many infrastructure projects that can be built up. Okay, with the help of private sector, government can make so many infrastructure projects, can build up so many infrastructure projects easily with the help of private sectors, and that is why it has started playing a very important role in the infrastructure development. And what is saying here? It is saying here that there are so many infrastructure projects that government alone cannot complete. There are so many infrastructure projects which governments cannot complete alone, but now they can complete with the help of private sectors. Okay, and that is why the private sector plays an important role in infrastructure development. Third point is a majority of our people live in rural areas. So we know that the majority means more than 70% people still live in rural areas in our country. Despite so much technical progress in the world, rural women still using biofuels. So we see that and we know that our world is technically progressing every day, every year, every month. Our world is progressing technologically or technically. Okay, but if we see our rural women, if we see our country's rural women, they are still using biofuel means they are using some crop residues, cow dung, fuel woods. These are the things they still using for their energy requirements. okay, for their energy requirements, for their need, for their purpose of energy, for their use of energy. They still using some biofuels like crop residues, cow dungs, fuel woods. They collect and they use it for their energy requirements. Still now, according to 2001 census, still now 90% of the rural household use biofuels. 90% of the rural households still using biofuels like crop residues, cow dungs, fuel woods. They collect and they use for their energy requirements. Next point is, rural peoples have to travel long distance to fetch fuel, water, and other basic needs. That means our in rural areas, roads connectivity, that means communication is not good. With this statement, it is clear that rural connectivity, rural roads, rural communication is not good, and that is why they have to travel a long distance. They have to travel a long distance in rural areas. A long distance in rural areas. They have to travel a long distance in rural areas to collect fuel, or water, or other basic needs. All these they have to collect, and they have to cover a long distance. They have to cover a long distance to collect all these things, their basic needs, to collect their basic needs, water, fuel. They have to cover a long distance. As per census 2001, 56% of the rural household had no electricity connections. Only 56% of the rural household only had rural electricity connection. That means they had electricity connections. According to 2001 census, only 56% of the rural household had direct electricity connections. That means 44% of the household in rural areas, they do not have electricity connections. And the last water is, tap water availability is limited only 24% of the rural household, and the remaining household make use the water from open sources. So it is a very sad point that in our country, according to 2001 census, 24% of the household in rural areas, they have access the tap water. They have access the tap water. But the remaining 76% households, they do not have the tap water facilities. That means they do not have clean water facilities. They do not get the clean water from their livelihood, or for their families. They do not get pure drinking water. Okay, and that is why in 2001 census, it is clear that only 24% of the households, they are limited. These 24% are limited. These 24% households are only getting tap water facilities, and the remaining 76% of the household in rural areas, they have to collect water from open sources. Like wells, tanks, ponds. These sources they have to use to collect the water for their different purposes. As per the National Sample Survey Organizations, access to improved sanitation is only 6%. According to 1996 data, the National Sample Survey Organizations submit a report. They submitted report, and this report says that only 6% of the rural household, they can only improve their sanitation facilities. And the remaining 94% of the household, they cannot improve their sanitation area or sanitation facilities. Okay, so these are the scenarios that we have seen in our states. These are the scenarios that we have seen in our states, in our country, and that is why we studied the state of infrastructure in India. So this is the scenario of state infrastructures. Okay, and this is the points that we have to discuss. These are the points that we have to discuss if this questions comes, that discuss briefly the state of infrastructure in India. So these are the points we have to discuss. Okay, so in my book it is 2001 census data is discussed. I think in your new books you will get 2011 census. Okay, you will get 2011 census reports, and according to your book you just read and write accordingly. Okay, next we will discuss health.